Hello,
1 second, try now.
hello.
So,
That's good.
you want me to leave it on or off? Off.
Hmm.
Good evening, everyone. I am Denise Marshall, and on behalf of the Ferguson Library and our partners, Connecticut Public Radio and the Friends of the Ferguson Library's Freedom to Read Committee, of which I'm the co-chair, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, which features Stephen D. Solomon, who's the author of the book, Revolutionary Dissent: How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. Professor Solomon will open tonight's program with a presentation about the history of our First Amendment rights, and that will be followed by a panel discussion, which will be narrated by Lucy Nalpathanchil, Vice President of Community Engagement for Connecticut Public Radio. And then we'll have a Q&A period that will follow, and that will conclude our program. And tonight, books will be available over at that table. You won't want to miss that for purchase from Elm Street Books. And Professor Solomon will be available and very happy to sign your book at the end of the program. So let me tell you a bit about him. Stephen D. Solomon is a graduate of Georgetown University Law School, University Law Center, and professor of journalism at New York University, where he teaches First Amendment law. He's the founding editor of First Amendment Watch, which provides news, commentary, legal, and historical context for the many free speech conflicts around the U.S. today. He's the author of several other books, including Ellery's Protest: How One Young Man Defied Tradition and Sparked the Battle Over School Prayer. And he's currently working on a new book, A Republic of Rights, to be published in February 2026. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Solomon to our Ferguson Library.
Thank you so much. What an honor to speak at a public library. Of all the places that I speak, there's nothing like speaking at a public library. I walk in the door down below, and there's books all around. Books, books, books. It's like going into Books Library at NYU, my favorite place. And so I think, this is a place where people come to read, they come to discuss things, to study, to exchange ideas. This is a great achievement of our civilization. And there's a reason why we have libraries, and we're able to have libraries with a wide range of books and thought. And the reason is right there. And this First Amendment, I should say, some great things come in small packages. This is only 45 words long, 45 words, and it protects 5 critical rights: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And they weren't just put there just randomly. I mean, after all, there are 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. These rights were collected there for a reason. And it tells a narrative of democracy, as we'll see. Those rights were placed in the First Amendment. They were put in a certain order to tell a story of democracy and what it takes to keep a nation free, to keep a representative government, functioning representative, where we elect people, we unelect people when we don't like them, and we have the freedom of thought. And the First Amendment, the way it's written and its narrative style is unequaled. It was a new idea in the history of mankind. And this came out of the first Federal Congress, ratified in 1791. And we're going to talk about this tonight, and we're going to come back to this slide later. because I think by the time we get to the end, you'll see how those rights work together into a narrative of democracy. We're going to start with a story about this fellow, Virginia Royal Governor Lord Dunmore, who you may not have heard about before. There's a lot of people from the founding period who are much more famous than him. But let's set the scene. 1775, so this is a year before the Declaration of Independence, and the war had already broken out. So April of 75, of course, was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. A couple of months later, Bunker Hill. So the fighting was already going on. Now you move to the summer of 75 and you move south from the Massachusetts and Boston, and you have a lot of things going on in Virginia. Virginia is the most powerful state, the most important state, by virtue of its size, its wealth, its intellectual capacity, with people like Jefferson and Madison and Mason and Randolph and Patrick Henry and on and on. These were really deeply intellectual founders. And in Virginia, the royal governor, Dunmore, was very unpopular, just as royal governors were unpopular all over the colonies because of the rift, the growing rift between the colonies and England. And Dunmore took a lot of heat. People disagreed with him. They wrote in the newspapers. There were about half a dozen papers in Virginia at the time, and they all took aim at him. And there was a lot of vitriol, plus very deep analysis of course, of what Parliament and George III were doing and how Dunmore was carrying out their policies. And Dunmore didn't like it. So he left in June of 1775, he left the capital of Williamsburg, and he went aboard a ship, a man of war, in Chesapeake Bay, partly for safety, but also just to escape all the vitriol. And so he was out there on the man of war, and he and the admiral were intercepting fishing boats, and they were sending soldiers onto land, and they were having skirmishes with the Virginia militia. And he was getting the Virginia newspapers on board the ship, and he's getting really, really angry. So what does he do? On Saturday, between 2 and 3 o'clock, an officer and 12 or 13 soldiers and a few sailors landed at the county wharf in Norfolk under cover of the men of war and marched up the main street to Mr. Holt's printing office from the Norfolk Intelligencer, and from whence, without the smallest opposition, they deliberately carried off the types and sundry other printing implements and 2 of the workmen. In other words, he stole the press. That was a good solution to his problem. He stole the press. He didn't sue anybody. He didn't take any other trouble except by sending soldiers to the printing house. They picked up the printing press. They put it on the boat. They went out to the man of war. They kidnapped 2 people, as they said, to run the press. And then they took over the press and started putting out propaganda for the king. He understood the power of the press. 1775. Okay, so we're going to come back to this as we move through the story. And the story really starts in the 13th century. And this is what the colonies are fighting about in terms of freedom of speech. 1275, Parliament passes a law, and it says, as you can read, any slanderous news or false news or tales whereby discord or occasion of discord or slander may grow between the king and his people or other great men of the realm. Now, this is before the printing press, but the king and Parliament were very worried about dissent, very worried about criticism of what they were doing. And so this law punished false news that criticized any official actions of the king or men of the realm. Now, parenthetically, you might notice false news. Today, fake news. I can't prove it, but this may be one of the early instances of the use of that term. It's just changed a little bit. But the meaning remains the same, right? I mean, we hear about that in 2024. Fake news, false news is criticism of people in power and criticism that they don't like. And so it's false news and they want to do something about it. They want to punish. So what you're hearing in 2024 is actually a 13th century concept. Does that make you feel good? That's what it is. It's a 13th century concept. And that is what framed what happened in the colonies as they pushed back against this kind of punishment of speech. Well, in 1606, the top court in England, expanded this crime of seditious libel. So libel, defamation, is when you criticize and you cause harm to reputation. So you criticize the king or parliament, and they're worried about maybe some unrest will occur because of it. And the definition was expanded in 1606 to include not just false information, but truthful information. Does that make sense? Well, in a way, it does, because if you put out false news, then the king or parliament, whoever, has the opportunity to rebut it. If you put out truthful information that they're doing something wrong, what are they going to do? That's, in a way, even worse, a worse situation for them. So they actually said that the truth exacerbated the libel. It exacerbated the libel. It made it worse because there's nothing the king or parliament could really do. And then Justice Hole explained that. If seekers are not punished for possessing the people with an ill opinion of the government, no government can subsist. For it is very necessary for all governments that the people should have a good opinion of it. Good government couldn't exist unless the people liked the government and expressed their support for it. So seditious libel punished people when they expressed opposition to the government, criticism of official action, criticism of the officials themselves. So criticism was criminalized under English law. So along came the printing press, and that made things even worse from the standpoint of the king, because prior to this, people would write, scribes would write things down, and people would write letters, and people would talk, but there was really not a very easy way to get information out there to a lot of people. But then along came the printing press. That enabled dissenters to spread their criticism widely. I mean, how many copies could you bring off a press? Lots of them. And so this became a major, major threat to the king and parliament. And so they began a licensing system whereby if you produced a manuscript, you produced a letter and you wanted it published, it would go before a censor for the king. And the censor would read the material and agree to its publication or not. And if you're hired as the king's censor, I think you keep your job by censoring. And that's what happened. And so what you had was a complete system of repression. Censorship before publication, that is, you could stop things from being published at all, but if anything got by, you could go after people for seditious libel. So this was the system of repression before publication and after. It was complete. John Milton opposed the censorship of books in the context of, especially of a pre-publication censorship that I was just talking about. And he said, what are you afraid of? False information or truthful information that you just disagree with? And he said, in a very famous quote, "Let truth and falsehood grapple." He uses a wrestling metaphor. "Let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worst in a free and open encounter." So like, get the ideas out there, let people discuss them and decide what's right, and then implement those ideas. Very powerful idea, but that was not the idea of the king. He was himself a dissenter. Well, the licensing system expired at the end of the 17th century, mainly for commercial reasons, because newspapers became much more, they became a commercial vehicle for books and pamphlets and advertisements that helped businesses grow. And so Parliament just decided, we'll let the licensing system expire because we still have seditious libel. We can still go after people once they publish something. And so William Blackstone, when he wrote the commentaries of the laws of England, said the liberty of the press is essential to the nature of a free state. But this consists in laying no previous restraints on publications and not in freedom from censure for criminal matter when published. So let people publish, but if they publish something you don't like, if it's critical, you can put them in jail. Well, that's an improvement. But if what's going to happen to you is you're going to end up in the Tower of London, I think that might chill speech. And in fact, people did go to the Tower of London. People were beheaded. People went to the scaffold for writing things that the king didn't like. And when I talk about the king, I'm talking about multiple kings here. So the system in England, the idea of freedom of the press became the freedom to publish, but not freedom from punishment after, criminal punishment. We're not even talking about like civil punishment that we have today, but criminal punishment. So, of course, being English colonies, we inherited this system. And there were 1,200 seditious libel prosecutions in the colonies before 1700. What's the cost of criticizing the government in colonial America before 1700? Well, New London County is not so far away, right? John Wheeler didn't like paying taxes, so he said that the public officials sit here to pick men's pockets. And for that, he was fined £5, which is a lot of money back then. Then you had Edward Arbery, who didn't like the actions of the Maryland legislature. I'll let you read that. And 39 lashes on his bare back. That hurt. 39 lashes on his bare back for saying that. This is seditious libel. Philip Ratcliffe, speeches against the government and church at Salem. Look at his punishment. Might that persuade you that we call it the chilling of speech today? You don't say something for fear of punishment. Something bad could happen to you. And so part of this was, of course, punishing the speaker, but also the effect of chilling speech in the community, knowing that you could be the next person. Okay, it gets worse. Look what happened to Richard Barnes. Ouch. Yeah. Terrible. Again, the deterrent effect of this punishment, this really harsh punishment, the chilling of speech. So this is what was going on before 1700. But there's now pushback. 2 English journalists writing under the name of Cato, became Cato's letters because there were so many of them. They were published in America. And why do you think they used the pseudonym? May I suggest that they were concerned about being arrested. And so there was a lot of use of pseudonyms. And one of the things that Cato did was criticize the whole system of seditious libel. So he used a pseudonym in part to avoid being punished under seditious libel while he was criticizing seditious libel as a crime. So he says, well, first compare to what Justice Holt said. It's necessary for all governments that the people should have a good opinion of it. And Cato says, well, yes, they ought to speak well of their governors if their governors deserve to be well spoken of. But we know that not all governors do things that we like. And to do public mischief without hearing of it is only the prerogative of tyranny. So he puts forward this idea that speech is critical to holding public officials in check. Without that, a public official can do virtually anything. Very important concept. And this is 1720. And this is, Cato was widely read in the colonies. And now you're starting to see some resistance to seditious libel. There's a trial in New York, John Peter Zenger, who was a printer, and he took on the royal governor of New York with a lot of criticism. And he was arrested for seditious libel. And Cato's letters were widely published at that time because they supported John Peter Zenger. And the governor, the royal governor, was so unpopular that the lawyer for John Peter Zenger went into court and he virtually admitted that Zenger had committed the crime of seditious libel. But he said, how can you punish my client for speaking truth? He speaks truth, and all of you know he speaks truth because all of you in your homes and in the taverns are saying exactly the same thing about this guy. The jury must secure the right of opposing arbitrary power by speaking and writing truth. He should have been convicted under the law of seditious libel. The jury goes out, and half an hour later, they come back and they say, not guilty. It's called jury nullification. The jury's saying, we're not going to follow the law because we find the law to be unfair, unjust, and we're going to ignore it. So if you're going to follow the law, he would have been convicted, that he was freed and he became a hero. Things are starting to change. So that's 1735. Now you jump ahead into the period where you're starting to have the troubles with England. And actually starts a little bit before 1765. But 1765 with the Stamp Act, that brought up the whole, the opposition and the question of taxation without representation. The Stamp Act imposed a tax on a lot of different goods in America. And they made a very big mistake. They taxed newspapers. They actually taxed newspapers, perhaps not realizing the power that the press had. And so all the newspapers, regardless of what they might have thought otherwise, they all opposed the stamp tax. And they carried the protests against the stamp tax and the essays and the letters all attacking the British Parliament for passing the stamp tax. And how were they going to spread this protest? Of course, they're going to go on Facebook, right? Twitter or X. Well, how would they do it without kind of electronic communications we have, without broadcasting, without social media, just with a printing press? I don't know. How do you really spread the word? Well, this is actually what they used. some of those things obviously come by off a printing press, but sermons, prayers, declarations, petitions, poems, songs, they used every possible way to protest against British authority. Every possible way. Within their experience, they used everything. Protest is growing. Now, the protest, all of this is a violation of seditious libel laws. It's all criminal, what they're doing. One of my favorite characters, Ebenezer McIntosh. This is an example of what they did. Ebenezer McIntosh was a shoemaker in Boston. And he worked with an organization called the Loyal Nine, protesting against the British with the Stamp Act. And they decided to dedicate a Liberty tree in Boston. And so one day, that's colonial Boston. Let me stop just to show you that Boston in colonial times was connected to the mainland by just this little piece of land. All of this is now, today, this is all filled land. Here's Boston Common. And what they did was right here, this is the main artery into Boston. They dedicated a Liberty tree right here, the biggest tree in town. And from the tree, they hung in effigy the British Prime Minister. Wow. I mean, talk about seditious libel, hanging the British Prime Minister. This is Ebenezer McIntosh and some of his friends, some of the patriots. You think, oh my goodness, how long are they going to last? Well, half the town, more than half the town came out. They dropped what they were doing. They came out to the Liberty Tree. They started talking with one another. They heard speeches against the Stamp Act. So this is a means for spreading dissent, spreading criticism. And again, all of it was illegal, but everybody was doing it. News spread virally, even back then. Well, now we can use, our cell phones to send things immediately and even live stream things that are happening. Back then, newspaper in Boston would be published describing the Stamp Act protest, and a rider on a horse would load up newspapers and gallop off, stop at a newspaper in Providence, drop off the Boston paper, then go to Poughkeepsie, then go to New York, then go to Princeton, then go to Philadelphia, all the way down the coast. There were no copyright laws then. So they reprinted the stories from Boston in all the newspapers. And then what you had was copycat demonstrations. Liberty trees all over America with the British Prime Minister hanging from a branch. All over America. And then you can actually read the accounts from Boston to Savannah of this kind of activity happening. It all started in Boston and it goes down the coast. The 18th century version of viral spread of the news. And so again, protest is spreading. Everybody is doing it. Here's an example of some of the things that were written about the British royal governor. Actually, this is against the British Prime Minister. Go hang yourself. You're so bad, and we'll give you the rope to do it. Now, we may look at that today and say, well, I've seen a lot worse. But let's forget about today. This is the 18th century, and people are a lot more restrained generally. But now they're really angry, and so they're saying, you deserve to hang. And actually, we hung you in effigy, right? But actually, we'd be happy if you came here and we would do it ourselves. obstinate perseverance in a path of malice, a diabolical thirst for mischief is the motive of your conduct. This is about as strong criticism as you can get in the 18th century. And this is what's going on against the governor in Massachusetts, against the British Prime Minister. So in Boston, and this happens elsewhere in the colonies as well, but in Boston, the royal governor goes after the Boston Gazette, which is the most radical newspaper in America. And they convene 3 times, or maybe even 4 times, they convene grand juries. And they say, this newspaper continually criticizes the royal governor, the British Prime Minister. They're guilty of seditious libel. We want an indictment. Every time the colonial grand jury said no. So finally, the British royal governor goes to the Massachusetts Assembly. He says, do something about this. And instead of doing something about it, the Massachusetts Assembly, made up of the people, issues this statement. The liberty of the press is a great bulwark of the liberty of the people. It is therefore the incumbent duty of those who are constituted the guardians of the people's rights to defend and maintain it. So the Massachusetts Assembly, elected by the people, is now standing up for the people's rights to criticize, even in the face of seditious libel prosecutions. They're saying no. Now I want to point this out to you. What you see through the colonial period is a constant reference, not just the freedom of the press, but the press as a bulwark of liberty. Think about this for a minute. There's a lot of rights that could be protected, but the only right in America, and this goes right up to the Bill of Rights, the only one that's actually described with a meaning to it, like a reason, is the press, because the press it's just not nice to the public. We're just not, protecting people so they can write and stuff. This is all in the context of protecting rights generally. The right to a jury trial, the right to be free of searches without warrants. All the things that are protected in the Bill of Rights, eventually, if the press is not there to criticize actions that violate rights, then how do you protect yourselves? So the press, the freedom of the press is a right, but it's a right that has a larger function to it, a bulwark of liberty. John Adams has some really interesting things to say. Our presses have groaned, our pulpits have thundered, our legislatures have resolved, our towns have voted. The crown officers are in retreat. Seditious libel is gone. It's still on the books, but it's unenforceable. It's a dead letter in the colonies. You see what's going on here. America, through its protests, is defining a new way forward in terms of speech and what is going to be protected. Think about a nation born in protest, having to protect protest, protect criticism from official punishment. This is what's going on. Samuel Adams, his cousin, is one of my favorite quotes. There's nothing so fretting and vexatious, nothing so justly terrible to tyrants and their tools and abettors as a free press. The press up against tyrants, keeping tyrants at bay. This idea is developing. John Dickinson is called the penman of the Revolution because of his extensive, learned critiques of the British acts of taxation and so forth. And he takes on the pseudonym of the farmer from Pennsylvania. farmers were very much revered in colonial society, and writers took on pseudonyms that were revered. So another form of protest, Paul Revere. You're probably familiar with this famous engraving of the Boston Massacre. Well, actually, Paul Revere told a story. And he told the story, a very effective protest without speaking a word. 3 engravings. First, the landing of the troops in 1768. Boston troops land in Boston. Notice how he portrays Boston. In the background, this sleepy New England village dominated by church steeples. And in the foreground, these ominous, large British warships disgorging redcoats into the city. A standing army into an American city. Americans hated that. It was like being conquered by another power. What's the inevitable result? This. The standing army ends up massacring civilians. And then thirdly, the coffins. Look at the story you told through engravings. Of course, the engravings were printed and they were distributed throughout the colonies. Very, very influential. So, as I said, seditious libel was pretty much a dead letter. A nation born in protest saw free speech as essential to the fight against tyranny. Back to Royal Governor Dunmore. Well, you can see now where we are. The only thing you can do is steal a press. That's where we are. He has no effective way of actually prosecuting people who are criticizing him. So he does what a tyrant does. He shuts down the press. This is the first step in all authoritarians when they take power. Shut down the press, take over the presses, keep them from publishing. That's his idea, 1775. Okay, so you go, that's 1775. This is 9 months later. In June of 76, just less than a month from the Declaration of Independence, George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights as Virginia moves away from Britain. It, in effect, declares its own independence. George Mason writes a Virginia Declaration of Rights to protect the people of Virginia, not from the crown, but from a new government that is forming in Virginia. And Section 12, the first constitutional protection for freedom of the press. Not just in America, but anywhere. And again, this is what they believed, and it comes up again and again. Skip forward to 1787, the Constitutional Convention, and you have the failure of the Articles of Confederation. They're too weak, and so the Constitutional Convention is called, and they rewrite, well, they actually don't rewrite the Articles of Confederation. They start over, and they write a constitution over the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. And it starts to dawn on some of the people in the convention, like George Mason, that this new central government is being given powers that are very strong. And they start worrying, is this government going to end up doing to the people what George III did to us? And so George Mason says, we need a Bill of Rights. He was voted down. No Bill of Rights in 1787. George Mason refuses to sign the Constitution, mostly for that reason. So once the Constitution is signed in Philadelphia, it goes out to the states, 13 states. They need 9 to ratify in order for the Constitution to go into effect for those that ratified it. And you can see how it goes. Goes pretty well. Goes pretty well. 3 cheers for Connecticut. Then it's starting to get into trouble. Those of you who may have thought that the Constitution just sort of slid into ratification might be surprised Massachusetts barely ratified because they wanted amendments. They thought that the federal government was too powerful. And among the amendments they wanted was a Bill of Rights. And so there was a compromise that essentially got some of the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, to vote yes. And even then, they barely got ratification. Rhode Island rejected. Maryland approved, becoming number 7. South Carolina, New Hampshire, just barely. And you can see we're now in a situation where all the states that are ratifying are doing so only on the basis that there should be amendments. Virginia, 89 to 79. New York, 30 to 27. And think about this, that when the Constitution had essentially was ratified because it had 9 states. So you've got New York essentially voting on whether to be in the Union or out of it. And even then, it was only 30 to 27. North Carolina, even at that point, rejected. And then the government goes into effect in March of '89, and North Carolina and Rhode Island then came back and ratified it a little bit later. The Virginia Ratifying Convention, one of the amendments that they proposed, George Mason and Patrick Henry demanded a Bill of Rights, and one of those rights that they thought most important was freedom of speech, writing, publishing, freedom of the press, bulwark of liberty. James Madison goes to the first federal Congress in 1789, and he proposes a Bill of Rights. And you see that this is exactly what he proposed in June of 1789 to the assembled First Federal Congress. And these are religion, right? Speaking, writing, publishing, the press, assembling, petition for grievances. That's what he proposed. So the First Amendment is ratified. 1791, the Bill of Rights is ratified in 1791. The first big test comes 8 years later, when John Adams and the Federalist Party passed the Sedition Act to punish the opponents, the political opponents. They were called Republicans. And as you can see, this was a seditious libel law, very much like the one from the 13th century. 15 prosecutions, most of those defendants were convicted, including a congressman, and 5 opposition papers were shut down or ceased publication. The Sedition Act never was adjudicated by the Supreme Court because it expired. There's a sunset provision after 2 years. The Federalists passed it, but they were worried that if they didn't win power again in the next election, if it was still on the books, it could be used against them. So it expired on the first day of the next administration. So it was never tested by the Supreme Court. But Madison, who wrote the Bill of Rights, wrote probably the most important defense of freedom of speech in America. And he defined it here: the right of freely examining public characters and measures, free communication among the people thereon, which is ever been justly deemed the effectual guardian of ever. So this is the bulwark of liberty idea again. Now, look what he says in one sentence: the right of freely examining public characters. Public characters are public officials. They are public figures. They are presidents. They are congressmen. They are senators. They are governors. Freely examining them. That means say what you want about them. The First Amendment protects you. Freely examining public measures. Well, what do the public officials do? They put out public measures. They propose things. And so you have to be able to criticize the ideas that these people have and be free to do that without fear of punishment. So a check, we call it the checking function of the First Amendment, where public officials behave badly, the press and the people can criticize without being punished. And the marketplace of ideas function of the First Amendment, freely examining public measures. Put all your ideas out there. Hey, we're in a library, lots of ideas here. That's a very important statement by Madison. And in the same essay, Madison recognizes the abuses of the press. He doesn't think the press, members of the press are angels. To the press alone, checkered as it is with abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression. So he recognizes that there are publications that are not fair, they go over the line, maybe they're even false, but they serve a function. Let people speak, let people publish. Well, 1964, the Supreme Court of the United States adopts Madison's interpretation of the First Amendment. It takes a long time, but there weren't many cases in the 1800s. And then New York Times versus Sullivan came up. It was actually a civil rights case. The press was down south covering the civil rights marches and sit-ins and all of that, and there were something like a dozen defamation suits against northern newspapers and broadcasting stations, New York Times being one of them. They tried to shut down speech by using defamation laws. New York Times versus Sullivan, probably the most important case in First Amendment law, and they talk about the central meaning of the First Amendment, a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. So this is the issues, is the marketplace of ideas. And then it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. So that's Madison's public figures and public measures. And they adopt that into constitutional law. Very powerful. Very powerful. And now we come back to the First Amendment. And I talked about it as a narrative. Madison put these 5 rights together deliberately, and he put them in the order in which they're shown here, deliberately. There's a story to tell. A narrative is a story. And it starts with the freedom of religion. We didn't talk about that tonight, but this was very important to the founders. The idea of the rights of conscience. The rights of conscience was a right to kind of figure out, with the help of religion or not, it's kind of your place in the universe and what your values are, who you are as a person. A lot of the founders were guided in some way by religion, but it was very much an inner kind of personal development. Now that they stepped out of that inner place. Whoops. What do you do when you step out of your inner place? You speak to people. You speak over a dinner table. You go to the tavern. You go to a coffee house. You talk about your ideas. You go to the public square. You're exchanging ideas. That's the freedom of speech. But Madison and the founders recognized that in a democracy, you can't limit it to the freedom of speech because it's not effective enough. You have to have a way to spread these ideas to a larger audience. And hence, the next right protected chronologically in the democratic process, from sharing ideas among ourselves to spreading it through an institutional press that reaches a lot of people. So you spread your dissent, you spread your criticism, you spread your ideas. Third right, once you've spread your ideas, you get together with like-minded people and you peaceably assemble. For what purpose? to petition the government for redress of grievances. That is a narrative of democracy, a narrative of a Republican form of government where the people can take control of their lives and effect change peacefully. Think about how this concept, this unique concept, for the first time expressed in 1789, was ratified in 91. Think about how it's affected all the 20th century movements towards expanding rights, for example, the civil rights movement, gender equality, I mean, on and on. It starts with people talking, then people circulating their ideas, people assembling and marching. Think about the civil rights marches in the 1960s and petitioning the government. This is the whole process, and it's a peaceful process of change where people are not supposed to be prosecuted. And if they're trying to get change, it means they don't like the status quo. And maybe they don't like the president, and maybe they criticize the president or their senator or their mayor or their governor or their school board president, and that's their right. I think this is a heritage that we've gotten from our founders. It's worth fighting for. It's something to pass on to our children, our grandchildren, and everybody else to come. Thank you very much.
Going to take a quick 5-minute break. We don't. Right into. Good evening. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil with Connecticut Public, and thanks again to Professor Stephen Solomon for your very interesting lecture. We have a condensed amount of time for this panel discussion, and we do want to leave a little bit of time at the end to take some of your questions. So I'd like to ask our other panelists to join us, and that's Alice Knapp and Michael Hyman. Please join us. So our panelists probably don't need introduction, but I will do a short one for those who are listening to the video at home. Alice Knapp is the CEO of the Ferguson Library. She was named to this role in 2014 after holding other positions at the Ferguson Library, including Director of Public Services and Director of User Services. In 2020, she was named one of Library Journal's movers and shakers. She also received the American Library Association Sullivan Award, which honors a library administrator who has shown exceptional understanding and support of public service to children. She was president of the Connecticut Library Association, also known as CLA, from 2005 to 2006, and was part of the fight alongside the Connecticut Four. You probably remember this, a group of librarians in Connecticut who filed the lawsuit Doe v. Gonzalez, challenging the constitutional validity of the national security letters issued by the FBI under the USA Patriot Act. She currently sits on the board of Stanford Partnership, the DSSD's Board of Commissioners, and the Connecticut Library Consortium. Alice, it's a pleasure to share the stage with you. Thank you. Michael Hyman is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and co-leader of the Equity Institute at Domus. For 10 years prior, he was director of Domus's Chester Addison Center, a vibrant family-centered community hub in Stamford's Waterside neighborhood. He was the vice chair of Stamford's Ferguson Library. He's part of the foundation, former Stanford NAACP president and board member of several educational, social, and religious agencies. In 2022, Michael was elected to Stanford's Board of Education and currently serves as its president. A self-educated history enthusiast, we need more of those, Michael was an Aspen Institute presenter on the What Every American Should Know national panel. He's a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College and an ordained Baptist minister. Michael, a pleasure to have you join us tonight. And we are all now acquainted with our special guest, Stephen Solomon, after his excellent presentation about how the founding generation formed American political culture that we know today, laid out in his book, Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. And I believe the book is available for purchase, so make sure you pick it up. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so this will be a lightning round. Are you ready? Okay. So we were originally going to present this program in October, and that was before the election. Now we know a new administration will be entering the White House on January 20th. The president-elect has made statements that he is an advocate of free speech. He's also threatened to arrest people who disparage him and to take away broadcast licenses of TV networks, just to name a couple references related to our First Amendment. Now, given your respective fields, what will each of you be watching in this new administration as it relates to our First Amendment protections? Michael, I'll start with you.
So this is on, right? What I will be watching is how the president responds to certain issues that are so important to all of us and free speech. The Project 2025 initiative that he disavowed, but nevertheless seems to be coming about, will have, we expect, a great impact on institutions like the libraries, institutions like our public schools, if in fact they decide to go after these types of things. It's interesting because free speech and the First Amendment is not just about, as our great speaker has told us this evening, isn't just about speech, but it's also about the other things that can be done that are considered to be speech, whether it's religion, whether it is the way you express yourselves. Several years ago, there was the case of Citizens United. Some of you may remember that with Hillary Clinton. What the courts decided essentially said that money is speech, and that billions of dollars could be used to impact and affect how people believe that. The Supreme Court, the justices upheld that it was a matter of expression and of speech, and used that. In some ways, they suggested that there would be no problem with people discerning. There would be transparency in how that money was spent. That was not, in fact, the case. And so I look at that, and getting back to your question there, I look at that and I see that at the same time, the new administration is suggesting that it may want to limit speech by not-for-profit organizations through their tax status. And so in one respect, we're saying you can pour billions of dollars into cultivating a certain type of speech, but that you may want to limit speech by cutting off those individuals or those organizations that are advocates for truth, free speech. So I'll be looking at some of those types of situations, and we all need to be aware of them.
Alice, we're sitting in a library institution known for protecting freedom of expression. Yeah. So as a librarian, I'm sure you've got many thoughts.
I have many thoughts on everything that Michael said, which is great to follow him. I am concerned about Project 2025 and the elimination of possible departments, Department of Education, Department of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which we rely on very heavily for a lot of background work, a lot of testing out of ideas. Very concerned about E-rate. And if you're not familiar with that, most public libraries, schools have discounted internet rates in order to make the internet available to those who don't have it at home. And it is heavily subsidized. What will happen to that? Because there's been calls for modifying those rules. And there was some money in the Infrastructure Act to subsidize digital navigators, making sure that broadband access was across the whole states. What's going to happen to those dollars, even though they've already been allocated? Will they be held? So we're very concerned about that. A little bit concerned about the atmosphere that might be created that might almost give permission to challenge more books and ban books locally.
Stephen?
Well, I worry about another version of the Sedition Act of 1798. So John Adams prosecuted and threw into jail journalists and other speakers who he didn't like, and he got away with it. The First Amendment, while it had been ratified 7 years earlier, it had not been interpreted yet by the Supreme Court. That would come many years later. So now there's at least a body of First Amendment law and judges to resist those kinds of prosecutions again. But it is something to worry about and something to be concerned about.
You're a professor of 33 years at NYU. When you talk to your students about not taking for granted our free speech rights, what you just shared, is it surprising to them?
Yes, it is. They don't come into class typically with a great background in history, and so that's one of the reasons why they're in class. And they come to appreciate their rights more when you go through something like we did in the last hour. So that's the process of education. It's why you have libraries, and you can find all kinds of ideas here. So about book banning, I mean, Thomas Jefferson sent hundreds of books to James Madison when he was studying to write the Constitution. Hundreds of books. Jefferson was in Paris, and Madison needed books. You can read the letters that Madison wrote. He didn't write to Jefferson saying, "Only send me books that I agree with." Jefferson bought in his lifetime 9,000 or 10,000 books. He had the largest library in America. He collected everything because it was of intellectual interest. And if something was contrary to his beliefs, he wanted even more to read it because it challenged him. It made him think more. And I think that's a value that we have to think about today when you have these book banning situations.
What about the digital space? You referenced, the power of the printing press. In modern times, we have our phones, which we could maybe consider the modern printing press, that we can go to all these social media outlets and we can voice our opinions and we can like certain posts, and certain posts get more eyes than others. It can contribute to movements. We've seen that, especially since 2020. But at the same time, we have this tool that it's very easy to spread mis and disinformation. And so I'm wondering, when you look back at all of the research and what we can learn from the founding generation, what would they have thought of social media as a tool?
Wow. So these are people who sent newspapers to South Carolina, and it took 6 weeks to get there. So, well, the thing to keep in mind is social media platforms have their own First Amendment rights, and they can curate their content the way they want, just like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal can. So, when if the government tries to tell them you have to eliminate certain things because it's disinformation or it's, we think it's lies. The First Amendment says, no, you can't do that because it's not up to the government to curate and prohibit speech, even when we think it's false. It's up to the marketplace of ideas to figure that out. Now, one exception, Alex Jones, right? Alex Jones talked about the Sandy Hook massacre, that it didn't happen. He was free to do that, as ugly as that was. Where he crossed the line was when he defamed the families by saying nasty things about them and false things about they were actors and things like that. And so that's why they won the case. So there are limits to disinformation. And I think that you're going to see lawsuits based on that. Same thing with Fox News when, with the 2020 election, that cost them $800 million in a settlement.
Michael, you're president of the school board in the city of Stamford. When we think about mis and disinformation, sometimes the hurtful rhetoric, inflammatory speech that can be easily shared depending on algorithms, how do we confront this? And, how do we educate the younger generations about a responsible way to voice their opinions?
Well, I will note that our author said during his talk that that it was okay to speak against the school board president.
Yes.
So I will take some license against that. We'll see if we can send some folk to the pillory for but in that instance, though, you're absolutely right. There is a concern about what happens with our schools and how do we address the freedom of the speech inside a school system. How do we make sure that we don't chill the atmosphere wherein teachers and educators cannot bring the intellectual properties that we may find out there, whether it's in books, whether it's in movies, whether it's in plays, bring that all to bear in our school system. When we do that, when we chill that opportunity, we lessen the opportunity for our young people to learn. And being absolutely right about the idea that I don't necessarily need everything that confirms my beliefs about the world. I need them challenged. And many times those challenges will make my beliefs either stronger, better, more viral to reach out to other individuals with. So that's an important part of education, to make sure that we have a robust discussion and that we're allowed and we're free to do that, even when it disagrees with my own views, that we should be intellectually and emotionally strong enough to have great discussions and to challenge ourselves. And so that's the type of school system that I think is so important. And I also believe that just last night, if you go back and watch some of the videos that of our own school board meetings, we had someone get up and demand, it's my right to speak during a school board meeting. And in those instances, they absolutely do have a right to speak. We want to cherish that, but we also cherish it under certain rules and certain ability to stand in front of everyone and not disrupt the meeting as well.
I've seen different press accounts depending on where people live. And there's also, in polarizing times, if school employees, teachers, principals share their political beliefs, they get dinged to the point where sometimes there's public pressure that these people be forced to resign. So how do school districts handle that in these heated times?
Well, in Connecticut, there are about 140 school districts. And around the country, there are about 12,000, 13,000 school districts. So when you look at that, there are folks who decide in a different way in different towns all across the country about how do they feel about whether a teacher is able to speak out. Many of you in this room are aware of the challenges that teachers had back in the 1960s and 50s when we were in school, and what happened if the teacher wore a dress that was too short. Would there be a conversation by the school board about that expression that was there? But we believe, in Stamford at least, that teachers do have the right to their own opinions, and that we should not abridge that in any way. But it does take good common sense to stand up and say, well, this is a little bit too far as a community standard. And so figuring out what that community standard is exactly what we all have to do and we all have to share in. And knowing that it will be tough, whether it's about the reactions of a teacher or whether it's about the books that we bring into the schools. And so people will in fact challenge those things, but we figure that out one book at a time, one challenge at a time.
We're going to take your questions in 5 minutes, but I wanted to go back to Alice Knapp because you spoke about book challenges. And, I am curious when you think about how the Ferguson Library works on its collection of materials, how do you ensure that there's a diverse viewpoints that are expressed in the materials in line with your community here that's also in line with the First Amendment?
Yeah, there's often there can be a tension between being aligned with your community and also having a diverse array of books, and for the intellectual curious, for the Thomas Jeffersons of the 21st century who want to read abroad and want to be challenging in their views. So we're very old school in how we collect books. Our librarians meet on a weekly basis, and in advance and prep to that, they read reviews. They do their homework. Do we need this in our collection? Is there a missing gap in our collection? Was the review good? Is this a good book? Is this something that should be added to the collection? And then we do audits. How are our areas covered? So it's not tedious because it's an art form. But it is a lot of labor to do this, to manage a collection and to make sure that you have all the diverse views that you should have. And what I would say that there are programs out there that help us, that we can do audits of our collection. They'll tell us you only have 3 books in this subject area. You're low here. But in the end, with the diversity of views, that's up to and we're big enough of a library that we have subject specialists. They have to know their subject area and to make sure that it is well represented. And one of the things that I was just listening to Dr. Emily Knox talk about book challenges and having a diverse collection. One of the things I think people have misunderstood, just because a book makes it into the library's collection doesn't mean that we are saying we approve of it. It's not like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. It means that it is a book that should be in the collection in terms of breadth of knowledge, diversity of views. So I often say to people, there are books in this library that are very offensive to me, but that's okay. There are books in this library that are very offensive to you, and that's also okay because they're not going to be offensive to somebody else, or you're going to read them and maybe start to see something in a different light. And I think that's it's so important in a democracy to have that diversity of views, because that's the only way we have to live together in disagreement sometimes. So how are you going to do that? You have to understand the other person, and it starts by understanding their views.
I want to be respectful of the audience who've listened to Professor Solomon and may have some questions for our panelists. So if you want to raise your hand, I don't know if there's a way to get a microphone. How about to this person right here in the black shirt?
Hello, thank you so much. I have 2 questions. So the first question that I have is with history. I noticed how you didn't mention blasphemy laws, especially in the context of England and colonial America. How, for instance, in the Quaker faith, James Naylor was charged with blasphemy, especially since he was on a pilgrimage to not Jerusalem, to London, and he had a bee as well as his tongue pierced because people interpret his religious performance as a form of blasphemy against the Church of England. And I just wanted curious as to how that influenced the First Amendment laws. In addition to that, as well as the rights of enslaved Africans, because they were also deemed as property, but also there were freed Africans in the colonial era that was against slavery, especially abolition, and how that formed the First Amendment rights. And the second question that I have is with today, especially with the rights of American journalists, because more recently, Jeremy Lafredo was detained by the state of Israel for covering what's going on in Gaza, and as well as a little over 2 years ago, Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Alka was killed by the IDF for covering what's going on in Israel. And I just want to know how the First Amendment protects them, especially since they're covering what's happening overseas. So those are my two questions.
Professor Solomon, do you want to take that question first? I know you've been a
Thank
professor
you.
at the J School.
So in terms of foreign journalists covering what's happening abroad, they're not covered by the First Amendment. They're on other soil. You're here and you're protected by the First Amendment. So journalists who are working in the Middle East, their rights, when they're violated, there's no First Amendment claim. Just like Chinese journalists, when they're censored by the Chinese government, or Russian journalists, if they're thrown in jail, they have no claim under the First Amendment. We can certainly advocate for them, but they're different societies, and so they don't go under the same rules. In terms of blasphemy, I didn't have an opportunity to cover everything in the time I had, but certainly you're quite right. Blasphemy is a form of, it's criticizing religious belief, and it's a violation of the First Amendment to punish someone for their criticism of religious belief. It goes under the basic First Amendment idea or principle that the government cannot censor speech based on disfavored ideas, right? And so someone who disfavors a religion or says something bad about a religion, they have a right to say that, just like they criticize a politician. So the government can't enter the marketplace of ideas and punish people based on their viewpoint, whether it's about religion or politics or any other thing that they're talking about.
We have time for a couple more questions.
In today's edition of the Stanford Advocate, there was a front page article that noted that Quinnipiac University had advised its foreign students to return before January 20th. My question for Alice Knapp, have librarians had meetings about pre-January or post-January 20th?
I can tell you we're a buzz. You know, I work with the Urban Libraries Council on their advocacy committee, and I work now on the Connecticut Library Association on their legislative committee. And why I can speak at great length about a fantastic legislative committee that was put together before the election. I tell you now, what we're talking about is making sure that everybody understands that our Division of Library Development in Connecticut is totally funded by the funding we get from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So if that goes away, a good chunk of the services that we've received from the state might also go away. So we're talking about it and we're trying to figure out what exactly to do. So part of it is a wait and see, because is this just talk, this elimination of Institute Museum and Library Services, or is this something that we're going to have to be concerned about in 3 to 6 months? But we need to be aware that there's consequences if the Institute of Museum and Library Services disappears, because that is federal dollars that helps underwrite services that you are receiving that you may not know, they may not be obvious to you because they're directly to the library. A good example of that is the Connecticut Library Consortium receives state funding to negotiate contracts for all of us libraries, academic, school, public, so that when we go out and buy a physical book, we're getting a hefty discount because it's the collective power of all of Connecticut. Well, what happens if we lose the federal funding at the state level? Will they still be able to fund the Connecticut Library Consortium? And then what does that happen trickle down if we aren't able to negotiate those contracts and where our spending power is decreased dramatically? So we're very much talking about it. You know, so far, the book challenges and I will say bans, and I can explain the difference between the two if you'd like, have been mainly local. And depending on the strength of the library's boards and the policies that the libraries have, they've either gone, you know, they've happened and they were resolved and nobody ever knew about it, or they become front page newspaper articles. But I don't think that at the federal level, that will be the impact. I think that'll still be a local problem. So my concern is really with those federal dollars. But the second thing that is going on is that there's legislation in states, and Idaho is a perfect example, that criminalizes library activity. So and Idaho is a great example because they've outlined certain books that libraries can't have, and if a librarian actually purchased it, they could be criminalized. They could serve jail time. We haven't seen that happen yet. What we have seen is librarians who have books that people object to. They've been suffered from social media attacks. They've been threatened. Their families have been threatened, that type of thing. I see that less happening in Connecticut. That just isn't our way. But I do see that happening in various different parts of the country. It's one of the reasons why in 2022, our library board voted to become a book sanctuary library. And then following that, our Mayor Simmons declared the city of Stamford a book sanctuary city. It was this understanding that we need to protect these challenged books and make them available. And we need to have programs like this so that we can talk about these issues, that this is going on across the country.
We have time for one more question. Who's the? Go
Before
ahead,
we
Nick.
do that, just I will disagree with Alice
Mhm.
for the very first time in our years of friendship. I do think that we will be under a certain amount of challenge, even here in the bluest of states in Connecticut. I believe that to be the case because the challenges of how to protect our rights and our liberties are at stake at this point. Never before have we been under this type of situation where people are concerned about what they say and what the ramifications of that might mean. And in our school system, that is going to happen if we were to get rid of the Department of Education. It says something else about where those dollars come from, that we may have all of us here who remember the civil rights era, which I am a part of. I'm telling you that around this country, that it will take those of us who are prepared to have our own Rosa Parks moment and stand up in a resolved way against some of the things that are expected to happen.
Professor Solomon, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to say that in terms of book bans, there are a number of cases in the courts now that are challenging the book bans under the First Amendment. And Alice, you very expansively discussed the criteria that librarians can legitimately use to choose books. What they can't do is ban books, pull books from shelves because they disagree with the ideas that are expressed. Everything that Alice said was what we might call viewpoint neutral. She was talking about criteria about the quality of a book and the reviews and what it contributed to the public understanding. But what you didn't say is that we put aside books that we as librarians disagree with, because that's unconstitutional. That's a violation of the First Amendment. But that's what's going on, and that's what's being challenged.
Time for one more question in the blue.
My question is for the speaker, and that is, from your perspective, is there anything we can learn from history that will help us balance out the protections of the First Amendment and its protection of speech, regardless of whether the speech is true or not? And how do we balance that out? And how do we as citizens encourage the people who have the public platforms to be more truthful? Since we can't go against the First Amendment, but within those constraints, because I would guess that when the First Amendment was being debated back and forth, there was a lot of discussion about things like that. And is there anything that we as citizens can learn that we can make use of to help encourage our fellow citizens, our elected officials, et cetera, to err on the side of veracity?
So I think ultimately the answer that the founders had, and I think which is valid today, is we have a marketplace of ideas. And there's always going to be, and there was then, disinformation, false information. And what the founders said, going back to John Milton, remember that quote, is enter the marketplace of ideas yourself and put your ideas out there, and let's have a test. Let's remember that wrestling metaphor? Let's have it out peacefully, but let's discuss and just assume that there's going to be a lot of false speech. I don't think you're going to get away from that. Social media, in some ways, brings out the worst in us. People can publish very quickly. You go back to the days of legacy media, there was a gatekeeper. Think about the broadcasting stations and the newspapers. There were editors there who looked at things that came in, and they would decide, does this contribute? Is this accurate? They weren't perfect, obviously, but things got vetted, in other words. Now, those legacy media are still there, much weaker than before, but everybody has a platform. And I think democracy invites comment, and if we can all comment, that's generally a good thing. But with that comes some real problems. And I think when you see speech that's you think is false, enter the fray and show that it's false. And I think that's what the founders would say, because the government can't be trusted to make those decisions. Think about a public official who you really like, who maybe you wouldn't trust with those decisions. But then that public official leaves office and somebody else gets into office. Do you trust them? Maybe not. But once you establish a principle where a government official can censor speech based on their ideas about what's true and false, you've given up the game to them. And then it's just a matter of who's making the decisions. So it's better for the people to keep that right, keep the government out of it. But that means that the people have to push back. So it's up to all of us, ultimately, to keep our rights.
It's a great place to end. I wish we had another 30 minutes, but please join me in thanking Professor Stephen Solomon, CEO of the Ferguson Library, Alice Knapp, and Stanford Board of Education President Michael Hyman. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Mm-hmm.